The law office of Mitchell & Sons had remained unchanged for as long as I could remember. The same mahogany paneling, the same leather-bound law books lining the walls, the same faint smell of lemon polish and expensive cologne. Even Mr. Mitchell himself seemed preserved in time, his silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses the only concession to the decades that had passed since he first became our family's attorney. We gathered there on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. The rain tapped gently against the windows, creating a soft backdrop to the uncomfortable silence that stretched between us. My sister Rebecca sat directly across from me, her posture perfect as always, one manicured hand absently touching our grandmother's necklace that hung prominently around her neck, a pendant of blue topaz surrounded by tiny diamonds on a delicate silver chain. "It matches my eyes," she had announced triumphantly at the funeral reception, making sure I overheard. Grandma always said it should go to me. The emphasis on me had been deliberate, a continuation of our lifelong dynamic where Rebecca received the spotlight while I stood in the shadows. My mother sat beside Rebecca, her face carefully composed into the neutral expression she had perfected during decades of navigating family tensions. My father had chosen the chair beside me, a small gesture of solidarity that I appreciated, even as I recognized its insufficiency against Rebecca's polished confidence. Mr. Mitchell cleared his throat, arranging the papers before him with deliberate precision. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who had delivered both fortunes and disappointments with equal professionalism. As you know, Catherine Elizabeth Bennet's last will and testament contains specific instructions regarding the distribution of her estate. My grandmother, Catherine to others, but always Grandma Kate to me, had been the family matriarch in every sense of the word. Widowed young, she had built a successful interior design business while raising my father alone, her strength and independence shaping our family's story across generations. Her death at 86 had left a void I was still struggling to comprehend. "Before I begin the formal reading," Mr. Mitchell continued, glancing at me briefly over the top of his glasses, "Mrs. Bennet included a personal note requesting that I follow her instructions exactly as written, regardless of any no expectations that might exist." Rebecca straightened almost imperceptibly, her fingers again finding the necklace at her throat, the blue topaz catching the light as she adjusted it for maximum visibility. The gesture wasn't subtle, it was a declaration of ownership, a reminder of her favored status in our grandmother's affections. I looked down at my hands, folded tightly in my lap, and prepared myself for one final disappointment. "Mr. Mitchell began with the standard legal preamble, his measured voice lending gravity to phrases about sound mind and revocation of prior wills. My attention drifted despite my best efforts to focus, memories of Grandma Kate surfacing unbidden, her teaching me to bake snickerdoodles in her sunlit kitchen, her patient guidance as I struggled with algebra homework, her quiet presence during my awkward teenage years when I felt most unseen by everyone else. The necklace had always been part of those memories. Grandma wore it for special occasions, the blue stone capturing light in a way that seemed almost magical to my childhood eyes. "My mother gave this to me when I turned 18, she had explained once while letting me try it on. "Someday it will be yours." I had cherished that promise, not for the necklace's material value, but for the connection it represented. A lineage of women passing down not just jewelry, but strength and wisdom across generations. Yet somehow, like so many other things in our family, the necklace had become Rebecca's domain. My sister had always possessed an uncanny ability to position herself advantageously, to reshape narratives in her favor through persistence and well-timed comments. Grandma said I remind her of herself at my age, she would mention casually at family gatherings. That's why she wants me to have her special pieces. I never directly challenged these assertions, partly because confrontation wasn't my nature, but mostly because no one else seemed to question them. Rebecca's version of reality gradually became accepted truth within our family ecosystem, a pattern established so early in our relationship that I sometimes wondered if I had imagined my own different memories. Regarding personal effects and specific bequests, Mr. Mitchell's voice cut through my reflections, drawing me back to the present moment. "Mrs. Bennet has outlined the following distributions." Rebecca shifted forward slightly, her posture suggesting both confidence and eagerness. My mother reached over to pat her hand, a small gesture of shared anticipation. "To my son James and his wife Margaret," Mr. Mitchell continued, "I leave my house on Maple Street and its contents, with the specific exceptions noted below, along with the sum of $100,000. My parents nodded, this bequest apparently aligning with their expectations. The house had been Grandma's home for over 50 years, a gracious Victorian filled with carefully selected antiques and artwork from her design business. Its disposition seemed natural and uncontroversial. To my granddaughter Rebecca, Mr. Mitchell continued, his tone unchanged despite the subtle tension that entered the room, I leave my collection of art books, my silver tea service, and the sum of $25,000. Rebecca's expression flickered momentarily before settling back into composed acceptance. The bequest was generous, but noticeably did not include the necklace she currently wore with such confidence. Her fingers rose to touch it again, perhaps unconsciously, as if confirming its physical presence. To my granddaughter Elizabeth, Mr. Mitchell turned his gaze toward me, using my full name as Grandma always had, despite everyone else calling me Ellie. I leave my design studio building on 3rd Street, including all business assets, inventory, and client relationships, along with the sum of $25,000, the studio. My grandmother's professional sanctuary and the source of her independence, a converted carriage house she had purchased when others told her a widowed woman couldn't run her own business. I had worked there summers during college, absorbing her approach to both design and client relationships, finding quiet satisfaction in the creative problem-solving each project presented. Rebecca's intake of breath was audible in the sudden silence. The studio represented not just sentimental value but significant financial worth in our growing lakeside community. Property, inventory, and an established client list that could generate substantial income for years to come. Additionally, Mr. Mitchell continued, his eyes still on me, I leave to Elizabeth my blue topaz necklace, which has been passed down through the women in our family for 3 generations. This piece is currently in my safe deposit box at First National Bank, accessible with the key included in the envelope I've left for Elizabeth. The implications of this statement hung in the air for a moment before landing with full force. Rebecca's hand froze at her throat, fingers splayed against the necklace she wore. The necklace that, according to Mr. Mitchell's careful phrasing, could not possibly be our grandmother's heirloom. There must be some mistake, my sister said, her voice carrying a brittle edge beneath its practiced composure. I'm wearing Grandma's necklace. She gave it to me before she died. Mr. Mitchell's expression remained professionally neutral as he reached into his desk drawer and removed a small envelope, placing it carefully on the desk before me. Mrs. Bennet anticipated there might be some confusion on this matter. She left specific instructions and documentation regarding the provenance of her blue topaz necklace. My mother looked between Rebecca and me, confusion evident in her expression. My father shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze fixed on the envelope that potentially contained explanation for what was unfolding. Perhaps, Mr. Mitchell suggested with careful diplomacy, we should continue with the formal reading before addressing any questions about specific items. Rebecca nodded stiffly, her hand finally dropping from the necklace as if its touch had suddenly become uncomfortable. For my part, I simply sat in stunned silence, trying to process what had just been revealed, not just about the necklace itself, but about the narrative I had accepted regarding my grandmother's preferences and intentions. The remainder of the will reading passed in a blur of legal terminology and asset descriptions. My grandmother had been meticulous in her planning, leaving specific instructions for everything from her gardening tools, to her longtime gardener, to her extensive collection of design magazines, to the local community college's interior design program. Each bequest reflected thoughtful consideration of both the recipient's needs and the item's best use, exactly the practical wisdom that had characterized her approach to life. Throughout these final provisions, Rebecca sat unnaturally still, her usual poised confidence replaced by rigid control. The necklace at her throat seemed to have transformed from triumphant accessory to uncomfortable burden, yet she made no move to remove or conceal it. My parents exchanged occasional glances, clearly trying to make sense of the unexpected turn the proceedings had taken. This concludes the formal reading of Catherine Elizabeth Bennet's last will and testament, Mr. E. Mitchell announced finally, closing the leather portfolio before him. Are there any immediate questions about the provisions as outlined? The silence that followed his inquiry felt weighted with unspoken tensions. Rebecca cleared her throat delicately. I believe there's been some confusion about Grandma's necklace, she said, her voice carrying the practiced lightness she employed when navigating difficult social situations. She specifically told me she wanted me to have it, Mr. E. Mitchell nodded as if he had anticipated this exact statement. Mrs. Bennet left very clear instructions regarding this matter. He turned to me, indicating the envelope that still sat untouched on the desk. Elizabeth, your grandmother asked that you read the contents of this envelope before we discuss the necklace further. All eyes turned to me as I reached for the envelope, my hand surprisingly steady despite the emotional turbulence of the moment. Inside, I found a handwritten letter on my grandmother's distinctive stationery, cream-colored paper with a subtle embossed border that she had used for important correspondence throughout my life. My dearest Elizabeth, if you're reading this, then Mitchell has executed my will as instructed, and you have learned about my decision to leave you my studio and the blue topaz necklace. I imagine this may have created some confusion, particularly if Rebecca is wearing what she believes to be my heirloom necklace. The truth, which I never corrected for reasons that seemed important at the time, is that Rebecca has been wearing a replica for the past 3 years. The necklace in my safe deposit box is the original, the one my mother gave me on my 18th birthday, the one I showed you when you were 12 and promised would someday be yours. Let me explain how this situation developed. 3 years ago, Rebecca began commenting frequently about the necklace, hinting increasingly that she expected to receive it. Rather than address this directly, I had a jeweler create a very similar piece with a blue topaz of nearly identical color but lesser quality and costume diamonds instead of real ones. When Rebecca asked to borrow the necklace for a special event, I gave her the replica, curious to see if she would notice the difference. She didn't, nor did she return it afterward. When I mentioned this, she claimed I had told her she could keep it, a conversation that never occurred. Rather than create family discord in my final years, I allowed her to believe she had the original. Perhaps this was cowardice on my part, or perhaps it was simply choosing my battles carefully as I felt my energy waning. The key enclosed will open my safe deposit box, where you'll find not only the original necklace, but a certified appraisal confirming its provenance and value, along with photographs documenting its history in our family across 3 generations. I realize this revelation may create tension, but I believe you will handle the situation with the quiet grace that has always characterized your approach to difficult circumstances. The necklace belongs with the person who values what it represents, not merely what it is worth or how it might enhance one's appearance. With all my love, Grandma Kate. I looked up from the letter to find 3 pairs of eyes fixed intently on me, my parents curious and concerned, Rebecca's narrowed with the dawning realization that her carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. Mr. Mitchell alone seemed unsurprised, his professional demeanor suggesting he had been fully aware of the situation described in my grandmother's letter. Perhaps, he suggested gently, it would be helpful if Elizabeth shared the contents of Mrs. Bennet's letter, as it directly addresses the question about the necklace. Rebecca's voice cut through the moment of consideration his suggestion had created. That's not necessary. What did Grandma say to you in private is private. She touched the necklace again, this time with less confidence. I'm sure we can sort this out as a family. The familiar strategy was immediately apparent. Redirect from public revelation to private family discussion, where dynamics could be managed through established patterns of influence and emotional leverage. It had been effective countless times throughout our lives, creating space for narratives to be reshaped according to Rebecca's preferred version of events. For perhaps the first time, I found myself unwilling to participate in this familiar dance. Actually, I said, my voice steadier than I had expected, I think Grandma's letter explains the situation quite clearly. I held the letter out, offering it first to my parents rather than directly challenging Rebecca. My father took it with visible relief at having documentation to navigate what had become an increasingly uncomfortable situation. The silence that descended as my parents read the letter together felt like a physical presence in the room. Rebecca's breathing had become slightly more pronounced, the only outward sign of her internal struggle to maintain composure. Mr. Mitchell busied himself organizing papers, tactfully providing a moment of privacy for our family to process this revelation. "Oh my mother finally said, looking up from the letter with an expression that mingled surprise and dawning understanding. This explains quite a lot, actually. It can't be true," Rebecca interjected before our father could speak. "Grandma would never do something like that, having a fake maid, letting me believe. It's absurd. She must have been confused when she wrote this." The suggestion that our grandmother had been mentally compromised was a new and troubling direction, one that could potentially cast doubt on the entire will if pursued. Mr. Mitchell seemed to recognize this implication immediately. "Mrs. Bennet underwent a complete cognitive assessment 6 months ago as part of her estate planning," he stated firmly. "The results confirmed she was of completely sound mind and judgment. Additionally, the safe deposit box contents, including the original necklace and documentation, were inventoried and photographed at that same time, with witnesses present." His prepared response suggested my grandmother had anticipated potential challenges, and had taken steps to ensure her wishes would be respected. The realization that she had been so methodical in her planning, even while allowing Rebecca to continue believing she possessed the original necklace, offered new insight into her strategic thinking during her final years. "I'd like to see this supposed original necklace," Rebecca said, a note of challenge entering her voice despite the increasingly untenable position she occupied. "Anyone could claim there's something in a safe deposit box." "That can certainly be arranged," Mr. Mitchell replied evenly. "The key is in Elizabeth's possession now. Perhaps you could both visit the bank tomorrow to resolve any questions about the items stored there." My father, who had remained unusually quiet throughout this exchange, finally spoke. "Rebecca," he said gently, "it seems your grandmother made specific decisions about her belongings, including the necklace. While this may be disappointing, we need to respect her wishes." The careful phrasing was typical of my father's conflict-averse approach, acknowledging the situation without directly addressing the deception Rebecca had perpetuated. It was the same approach that had allowed her to establish her version of reality as our family's accepted truth throughout our childhood and beyond. "I don't understand why she would leave the studio to Elizabeth instead of me," Rebecca said, pivoting slightly from the necklace revelation to what appeared to be a secondary but equally significant concern. "I'm the one who expressed interest in interior design. I'm the one who talked about possibly joining her business someday." This claim was so contrary to my own experience that I found myself speaking before fully considering the implications. "Rebecca, you've never spent time at the studio beyond occasional visits. I worked there every summer during college and have continued helping with projects even while building my own career." "Because she felt sorry for you," Rebecca replied sharply, momentarily abandoning her usual careful composure. "Your little teaching job barely pays the bills while I've built a successful career in marketing. She was trying to give you a safety net, not making a statement about who was more deserving." The directness of this attack, positioning my grandmother's bequest as pity rather than recognition of genuine connection or capability, reflected the private dynamics that had often unfolded between us when no others were present to witness. Rebecca's carefully maintained public persona occasionally slipped to reveal the more ruthless determination that drove her careful positioning within family and social hierarchies. "That's enough," my father said with uncharacteristic firmness. "Your grandmother made her decisions for her own reasons, which she appears to have documented quite thoroughly. This isn't a competition between you two." But of course, it had always been a competition from Rebecca's perspective, one she had consistently won through a combination of assertiveness, strategic narrative management, and the family's tendency to accept her version of events to avoid conflict. My grandmother's will and letter had suddenly challenged this established pattern, creating an unprecedented disruption to dynamics that had seemed immutable. Mr. Mitchell cleared his throat gently, reclaiming our attention. "Perhaps it would be helpful to focus on the practical next steps for executing Mrs. Bennet's wishes. The studio transfer will require some paperwork and transition planning. Elizabeth, do you have questions about assuming ownership of the business assets?" His redirection toward logistical matters offered a welcome shift from the emotional tension that had developed. As we discussed the mechanics of property transfer, client notification, and inventory assessment, Rebecca gradually withdrew from active participation, her expression settling into the distant neutrality she adopted when events weren't proceeding according to her expectations or preference. When the meeting finally concluded, she was the first to rise, gathering her belongings with efficient movements that suggested barely contained energy. "I have client meetings this afternoon," she announced to no one in particular. "We can discuss this further once everyone has had time to process everything." The familiar strategy, create space for emotions to settle, then re-engage when circumstances might be more favorable for reshaping narratives, was so transparent after years of exposure that I almost smiled despite the situation's complexity. Before anyone could respond to her implied postponement of resolution, Rebecca had turned toward the door, one hand unconsciously rising to touch the necklace that now represented a very different story than the one she had been presenting to the world. "Rebecca," I said impulsively, stopping her before she could make her strategic exit. "Would you like me to hold on to the necklace you're wearing until we sort everything out? Since it seems there's some confusion about which piece is which." The deliberate innocence of my phrasing, positioning her deception as mere confusion rather than deliberate misrepresentation, offered a dignified path toward resolution. For a moment, indecision flickered across her features as she calculated the social implications of different responses. "That won't be necessary," she finally replied, her composure partially restored. "I'll bring it tomorrow when we visit the bank. Then we can compare the pieces directly." With that conditional commitment, one that still preserved the possibility that her necklace might somehow prove to be the original, despite the documentation suggesting otherwise. Rebecca departed, leaving behind an atmosphere of unresolved tension and shifting familial dynamics. First National Bank's private client room offered discreet luxury: leather chairs, soft lighting, and the hushed atmosphere of institutional permanence. The mahogany table between us gleamed with recent polishing, creating an almost mirror-like surface that reflected the tense tableau we presented. Rebecca and me seated opposite each other, the bank manager positioned at the head of the table, a polished wooden box containing the safe deposit contents before him. Rebecca had arrived precisely on time, wearing a business suit that suggested she had scheduled important meetings afterward, a familiar tactic that would limit the duration of potentially uncomfortable encounters. The replica necklace was conspicuously absent from her attire, though she had placed a small velvet pouch on the table upon her arrival, its drawstring tightly closed. Ms. Bennett's instructions were quite specific, the bank manager explained, his professional demeanor suggesting he had facilitated similar family situations before. The contents were to be inventoried and verified by our staff whenever the box was accessed, with documentation maintained for estate purposes. He opened the wooden box carefully, revealing several compartments containing precisely what my grandmother's letter had described. The blue topaz necklace nestled in a vintage jewelry box, accompanied by a formal appraisal, a handwritten provenance document, and several photographs showing the necklace worn by my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and even briefly by me during that childhood moment when she had first shown me the heirloom. "Would you like to examine the piece?" the manager asked, directing the question to me as the named recipient in the will. I nodded, conscious of Rebecca's intensely focused observation as the manager lifted the jewelry box and placed it before me. The necklace inside caught the light immediately, the blue topaz displaying the distinctive depth and clarity I remembered from childhood, characteristics that had always reminded me of deep water, catching sunlight, changing slightly with every movement. "May I?" Rebecca asked, her voice maintaining remarkable steadiness despite the circumstances. I passed the box to her without comment, watching as she examined the necklace with careful attention to detail. After a moment, she reached for the velvet pouch she had brought, loosening the drawstring to reveal the replica she had been wearing so prominently at the funeral and will reading. Placing the two necklaces side by side created an immediate visual education in the differences between fine jewelry and convincing imitation. The genuine article possessed a depth and quality that its replica approximated but couldn't duplicate. Differences subtle enough to escape casual observation, but unmistakable under direct comparison. "The genuine article has a platinum setting rather than silver," the bank manager observed neutrally. "And the diamonds surrounding the center stone are old mine cut rather than modern brilliant cut. The appraisal notes these distinctive features specifically." Rebecca stared at the two necklaces for a long moment, her expression unreadable. I wondered what calculations were running through her mind, whether she was formulating alternative explanations, considering how to maintain her narrative despite the physical evidence before us, or perhaps, just possibly, recognizing the extent of her misrepresentation. "Grandma never told me this wasn't her necklace," she finally said, her tone somewhere between defensive and bewildered. "She let me believe it was the family heirloom." The statement contained a kernel of technical truth. Our grandmother had indeed allowed Rebecca to maintain her mistaken belief, while carefully sidestepping the question of how that belief had been established in the first place. It represented the skilled narrative management that had characterized my sister's approach throughout our lives, reshaping events to minimize her agency in uncomfortable situations. "Her letter explained why she made that choice," I replied, keeping my tone neutral rather than accusatory. "She valued family harmony during her final years." Rebecca's gaze lifted from the necklaces to meet mine directly, a rare moment of unguarded assessment between us. "You really didn't know, did you? About the replica? About her leaving you the studio? You were as surprised as I was." The question contained an implicit recognition that surprised me, an acknowledgement that she had previously assumed I might have been operating with information she didn't possess, engaged in some parallel campaign of influence with our grandmother. The possibility that my inheritance reflected genuine relationship rather than strategic positioning seemed to represent a new consideration in her understanding of family dynamics. "I knew she intended for me to have the necklace eventually," I said honestly. "She told me that when I was 12, but I thought you had somehow convinced her to change her mind. I never imagined she had a replica made." This admission of my own assumption, that Rebecca's narrative had successfully influenced our grandmother's decisions, represented a small but significant shift in our typically guarded interactions. For perhaps the first time, We were acknowledging the complicated reality beneath the polished surfaces of family relationships. The bank manager, sensing a potential movement toward resolution, spoke with diplomatic precision. According to Mrs. Bennet's documented wishes, the original necklace is bequeathed to Elizabeth, along with its provenance documentation and historical photographs. Would you like me to return the replica to you, Miss Rebecca? The question brought us back to the immediate practical matter at hand, the disposition of the two necklaces now lying side by side on the polished table. Rebecca looked down at them again, something complicated moving across her expression before she regained her usual composure. "Keep it," she said abruptly, pushing the velvet pouch containing the replica toward me. "It was meant to look like the original anyway. Maybe you can use it for everyday wear when you don't want to risk the real thing." The gesture contained layers of potential interpretation, practical consideration, reluctant acknowledgement, perhaps even a hint of genuine concession. Before I could formulate a response, Rebecca had gathered her purse and stood, her posture signaling the conversation's conclusion according to her timetable. "I have meetings all afternoon," she announced, another reference to her demanding professional schedule that reinforced her preferred self-image while creating natural exit from uncomfortable situations. "We should talk about the studio transition sometime next week. I may have some contacts who could be valuable clients." With that rapid pivot from relinquishment to offering assistance that positioned her as still valuable and influential, Rebecca departed, leaving me with two necklaces, a bank manager discreetly busying himself with paperwork, and the dawning realization that my grandmother's careful estate planning had created space for significant recalibration within our family system. The studio on 3rd Street had always been my favorite place in our lakeside town, a converted carriage house with high windows that flooded the design tables with natural light, walls lined with fabric samples and material catalogs, the back room filled with carefully organized treasures my grandmother had collected over decades in the business. Standing in the main workspace with the keys in my hand, ownership documents signed and filed, I felt both the weight of responsibility and the lightness of potential that came with this unexpected inheritance. Rebecca had been surprisingly absent from the transition process, delegating her husband to drop off some design books she'd borrowed from our grandmother and communicating about necessary paperwork through terse emails rather than direct conversation. My parents reported she had been processing the revelations from the will reading, a family euphemism for retreat and recalculation when events didn't align with expected outcomes. I had spent the week since our bank meeting contacting my grandmother's clients, reviewing ongoing projects, and meeting with the part-time assistant who had helped manage the business during our grandmother's final months. The studio was financially stable, with several significant projects in progress, and a reputation that continued to attract the town's most discerning clients. My background in art education provided useful perspective on color theory and spatial relationships, though I recognized the learning curve ahead in mastering the business aspects my grandmother had handled with such apparent ease. The door chimed softly, interrupting my inventory of fabric samples. I turned, expecting the wallpaper representative scheduled for later that afternoon, only to find Rebecca standing in the entrance. She wore casual clothes rather than her usual business attire, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail instead of the polished style she typically presented to the world. "I thought we should talk," she said without preamble. Away from mom and dad, without lawyers or bank managers watching. The directness was uncharacteristic. Rebecca typically preferred approach through indirection, establishing comfortable social dynamics before addressing potentially difficult topics. This departure from her usual strategy suggested something significant had shifted in her assessment of our situation. "Of course," I replied, gesturing toward the sitting area where my grandmother had often conducted initial client consultations. "Would you like some tea?" Grandma always kept a selection in the kitchenette. Rebecca shook her head, taking a seat in one of the comfortable client chairs while studying the studio space with new attention. "You've already started changing things around," she observed, noting the rearranged sample books and the project board I had updated with current timelines. "Just organizing according to my workflow," I explained. "The bones of the system are still Grandma's." Rebecca nodded absently, her attention moving to the framed photographs I had placed on the consultation table. Professional shots of completed projects spanning our grandmother's career, including several spaces that had been featured in regional design magazines. "I always thought I would take over the business eventually," she said after a moment of silence. "I had this whole narrative in my head. Marketing executive by day, gradually transitioning to interior design as a second career once I'd established myself financially. I talked about it sometimes when I visited Grandma. The admission surprised me, not the ambition itself, which aligned with Rebecca's tendency to accumulate achievements and identities, but the vulnerability inherent in sharing unfulfilled plans. Throughout our lives, my sister had carefully presented only successes and certainties, never works in progress or unrealized aspirations. She never mentioned that to me, I said honestly. No, she wouldn't have. Rebecca's gaze remained on the photographs rather than meeting mine. Looking back, she never actually encouraged the idea either. She would listen and nod, but she never offered specific suggestions or opportunities like she apparently did with you. The observation contained lingering hints of her initial reaction, positioning her exclusion as somehow unfair or unjustified, but also reflected genuine puzzlement at our grandmother's choices. For someone accustomed to successfully influencing others through persistence and careful narrative management, being unable to sway our grandmother's assessment must have represented a rare and confusing failure. I think Grandma recognized different strengths in each of us, I suggested carefully. Your marketing background and business acumen are impressive by any standard. My approach to design is more intuitive, more aligned with how she worked with clients. Rebecca finally looked directly at me, her expression more unguarded than I had seen since we were very young. You really believe that? That she was making decisions based on our actual abilities rather than just preferences or favoritism? The question revealed something fundamental about Rebecca's understanding of family dynamics, an assumption that resources and opportunities were allocated based on relational politics rather than genuine assessment of capabilities or interests. It offered a glimpse into the worldview that had shaped her approach to family relationships, including her determination to position herself advantageously through constant narrative management. I think Grandma was remarkably clear-eyed about people, I replied, after considering the question seriously. She built a successful business by understanding both design principles and human psychology. Her decisions about her estate probably reflected her best judgment about what would honor her legacy while supporting our individual paths. Rebecca absorbed this perspective with uncharacteristic thoughtfulness, her usual quick responses temporarily suspended. The necklace, though, she finally said, that wasn't about capabilities or career paths. That was about who she wanted to have a family heirloom. We had arrived at the heart of the matter, the object that had symbolized status and preference, that Rebecca had displayed so prominently as evidence of her favored position. The replica still rested in its velvet pouch in my apartment drawer, neither worn nor discarded since our meeting at the bank. The letter explained her thinking, I reminded her gently. She had promised it to me when I was young, before you began expressing interest in it. But she let me believe I had the original, Rebecca countered, the familiar defensive edge returning to her voice. For 3 years, she watched me wear a replica while letting me think it was the family heirloom. Who does that? The question wasn't entirely rhetorical. It contained genuine bewilderment about our grandmother's approach to the situation. Rather than directly confronting Rebecca's assumption of ownership, she had created an alternative reality that allowed surface harmony while preserving her actual intentions. It represented a strategic approach to family dynamics that neither of us had fully recognized until the will reading revealed its existence. Someone who valued peace in her final years, I suggested. Someone who recognized that certain confrontations wouldn't lead to resolution, but only to ongoing conflict. Rebecca considered this assessment, her marketing executive's mind perhaps recognizing the cost-benefit analysis inherent in our grandmother's approach. She knew me well then, she finally acknowledged with unexpected self-awareness. I wouldn't have given up easily on something I believed should be mine. The admission that she recognized her own determination to maintain narratives once established represented a small but significant shift in our interaction. For the first time in our adult relationship, we were discussing family dynamics with a shared vocabulary rather than through the usual layers of performance and positioning. I've been thinking about the studio, Rebecca said, changing direction with characteristic pivoting when emotional territory became too exposing. Your background in art education actually makes sense for the design aspects of the business, but the client development, the marketing strategy, the business growth potential, those require different skills. I waited, sensing a proposal forming behind her carefully constructed phrasing. We could potentially collaborate, she continued, watching my reaction closely. Not as equal partners in the business itself. I recognize Grandma left it specifically to you, but as consultant or advisor on the growth strategy and market positioning. The Bennett Design Studio has potential beyond its current client base. The suggestion was classic Rebecca, finding a path to involvement and influence even when direct control wasn't available, identifying mutual benefit that aligned with her professional strengths while acknowledging the new reality established by our grandmother's will. It represented both genuine business insight and her persistent determination to maintain positioning within any system she valued. 3 months after the will reading, the newly renamed Bennett Design Studio hosted an open house for clients and community members. The renovated space showcased both respect for my grandmother's established aesthetic and subtle evolutions, reflecting my own design sensibilities. Warmer colors, more tactile elements, carefully curated original artwork from local artists. Rebecca had contributed significantly to the event's organization and marketing strategy, leveraging her professional network to attract potential new clients while respecting my leadership in design decisions and client relationships. Our collaboration remained carefully bounded. Her role as marketing consultant clearly defined, my ownership of the business uncontested, but had proven more productive than either of us might have anticipated during those tense moments in Mr. Mitchell's office. My parents circulated among guests with evident pride, my father pointing out design elements to friends while my mother engaged potential clients with practiced social grace. The family presented a united front to the community, any lingering tensions invisible beneath the polished surface of the successful event. I wore the original topaz necklace, its blue stone catching the light as I moved through the studio spaces, a tangible connection to my grandmother's legacy that felt both personally meaningful and professionally appropriate for this milestone event. Rebecca had chosen to attend without jewelry, a small but noticeable departure from her typically accessorized presentation that suggested deliberate avoidance of comparing her usual adornments to the piece she had once claimed as her own. "Your grandmother would be immensely proud," Mr. Mitchell commented quietly, having arrived fashionably late with his wife. "Not just of the studio's evolution, but of how you've navigated these past months." The attorney's perspective, informed by decades of observing family dynamics through estate transitions, carried particular weight. He had witnessed countless inheritance situations devolve into bitter conflicts that damaged both relationships and assets, the very outcomes my grandmother had seemingly worked to prevent through her careful planning. "It hasn't been entirely smooth," I acknowledged, thinking of the delicate negotiations that had established Rebecca's consulting role and the occasional moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves in our interactions. "Smooth is rarely the objective in these situations," Mr. Mitchell replied with the wisdom of experience. "Functional is the realistic goal, finding arrangements that preserve value while allowing necessary evolution." His assessment accurately captured what we had achieved, not perfect harmony or complete resolution of long-established dynamics, but workable structures that accommodated both historical patterns and new realities. The studio continued serving established clients while attracting new ones. Family gatherings proceeded with adjusted but stable relationships. And the assets my grandmother had built over decades remained productive rather than becoming casualties of conflict. Across the room, Rebecca was engaged in animated conversation with a potential client, her marketing expertise evident in her focused attention and strategic highlighting of the studio's capabilities. Catching my eye briefly, she offered a small but genuine nod of acknowledgement, recognition of our shared achievement in creating this evolved version of our grandmother's legacy. Later, as the event wound down and final guests departed, Rebecca approached me directly for the first time that evening. "The necklace looks right on you," she said, the observation delivered with uncharacteristic directness. "I see now what Grandma meant about it belonging with someone who values what it represents, not just how it looks." The comment suggested reflection beyond our immediate situation, consideration of the values and perspectives that had informed our grandmother's decisions about her estate. Without directly acknowledging her previous misrepresentation, Rebecca was offering recognition that material objects carried meanings beyond their appearance or market value. "Thank you for saying that," I replied, accepting the olive branch for what it was. Not complete transformation of established patterns, but meaningful movement toward more authentic interaction. "I've been thinking about something Grandma used to say," Rebecca continued, her usual confident demeanor softened by genuine reflection, "that the true value of inheritance isn't in what's received, but in how it's carried forward." I didn't really understand what she meant until recently. The observation seemed to encompass both the tangible assets our grandmother had distributed, the necklace, the studio, the various items that constituted her material legacy, and the less visible inheritance of values, approaches, and family dynamics she had sought to influence through her careful estate planning. "I think she was playing a longer game than any of us realized," I suggested, using her estate plan to address patterns she observed but never directly confronted during her lifetime. Rebecca considered this assessment with unexpected receptiveness. She was always strategic, wasn't she? I thought I understood her approaches, but clearly I underestimated her ability to see multiple moves ahead. This acknowledgement, that our grandmother had operated with complexity and intentionality beyond what Rebecca had recognized, represented significant evolution in my sister's understanding of family dynamics. Her previous narrative had positioned herself as the strategic inheritor of our grandmother's approach to life and relationships. The will revelations had challenged that self-perception in ways she was still processing. "I think we both did," I admitted. "The replica necklace alone shows a level of planning and foresight I never would have expected." "A chess move worthy of a grandmaster," Rebecca agreed with reluctant admiration, creating a situation where everyone got what they needed rather than what they thought they wanted. As we stood together in the studio space that represented both continuity and transformation of our grandmother's legacy, I recognized that the true revelation delivered by Mr. Mitchell that rainy afternoon hadn't been merely about jewelry ownership or business assets. The lawyer had revealed a more fundamental truth, that our grandmother had seen us, both of us, with clear-eyed assessment of our strengths, limitations, and potential, and had structured her final gifts to address patterns long established but never directly acknowledged within our family system. The necklace around my throat and the studio space surrounding us represented not just material inheritance but invitation to evolution, opportunity to carry forward legacies of both object and approach, while allowing necessary transformations. Rebecca's gradual acknowledgement of this more complex understanding suggested our grandmother's strategic planning might indeed achieve its apparent objective, not erasing established patterns, but creating space for their thoughtful reconsideration. 1 year after my grandmother's passing, I stood in the studio's back garden, where we had created a small memorial space featuring her favorite roses and a handcrafted bench commissioned from a local artisan. The design business had flourished under my direction, with Rebecca's marketing consultancy helping expand our client base, while I maintained the personalized approach and quality standards that had defined my grandmother's practice. Our family relationships had found new equilibrium, not perfect harmony, but functional stability that acknowledged both historical patterns and evolved understandings. My parents had adapted to the adjusted dynamics between their daughters, occasionally serving as bridges when old tensions threatened to resurface, but increasingly allowing our adult relationship to develop without their mediation. Rebecca remained Rebecca, strategic, achievement-oriented, carefully attentive to social positioning, but with subtle shifts in how she engaged with family narratives. Our professional collaboration had created space for more authentic interaction, with mutual recognition of complementary strengths gradually replacing the competitive positioning that had characterized our earlier relationship. The blue topaz necklace had become my signature accessory for important client presentations and significant family gatherings, a tangible connection to my grandmother's legacy that felt neither triumphant nor burdensome, but simply appropriate. The replica remained stored in my jewelry box, neither displayed nor discarded, its continued existence a quiet reminder of complicated family dynamics and my grandmother's strategic approach to managing them. "I thought I might find you here," said a familiar voice, interrupting my reflections. Rebecca approached along the garden path, carrying 2 coffee cups from the artisanal cafe that had recently opened next door to the studio. "Mom said you were meeting clients this morning, but I figured you might take a few minutes for yourself first." Anniversary days tend to prompt reflection. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, remembering the significance of the date, anticipating my likely location, bringing my preferred coffee, represented the kind of attentiveness Rebecca had previously reserved primarily for those she considered strategically important in professional. Its extension to our personal relationship suggested genuine evolution rather than merely calculated adjustment. "Thanks," I said, accepting the offered cup. "I was just thinking about how much has changed in a year. And how much hasn't," Rebecca added with unexpected self-awareness. "I still catch myself sometimes, creating narratives, positioning for advantage, managing perceptions. Old habits run deep." The acknowledgement of these patterns, behaviors we had never directly named during our earlier years, represented significant shift in our communication. Where previously our interactions had operated through layers of performance and unspoken competition, we had gradually developed vocabulary for discussing family dynamics with shared understanding, if not always complete agreement. "Grandma understood those patterns better than we realized," I observed. "The will wasn't just about distributing stuff. It was about creating conditions for potential change." Rebecca nodded, sipping her coffee while studying the memorial garden with thoughtful attention. The lawyer revealing the truth about the necklace. That was the linchpin, wasn't it? The moment when my carefully constructed narrative collapsed completely. It was certainly theatrical, I agreed with a small smile. Mr. Mitchell delivering the revelation with perfect professional neutrality while essentially detonating a bomb in our family system. "Pure Grandma Kate," Rebecca said, a reluctant admiration coloring her tone. She always did understand the power of timing and presentation. I thought I learned strategic thinking from business school, but clearly, I had an expert practitioner modeling it throughout my childhood. The observation contained both humor and genuine insight, recognition that our grandmother had operated with complexity and intentionality that we had only partially comprehended during her lifetime. Her final estate plan had revealed not just material distributions, but carefully considered intervention in family dynamics she had observed, but rarely directly addressed. "Do you think she planned all of it?" Rebecca asked after a comfortable silence. The replica necklace, the studio inheritance, the letter explaining her decisions, was it all some grand strategy designed to create specific outcomes after she was gone? The question reflected the same curiosity I had periodically revisited throughout the year, whether my grandmother had meticulously orchestrated each element of her estate plan with clear intention, or whether some aspects had emerged from more intuitive responses to observed patterns and relationships. "I think she was both strategic and intuitive," I suggested. "She understood family dynamics and potential leverage points, but she also trusted natural processes to unfold once certain conditions were established. Like her approach to garden design, creating structure and initial composition while allowing for organic growth and adaptation over time." Rebecca considered this assessment, her marketing executive's analytical mind engaging with the comparison. "That's actually a useful framework for thinking about influence generally, establishing conditions rather than attempting to control specific outcomes. I might borrow that concept for my next client strategy session." The ease with which she could now acknowledge learning from my perspective, rather than automatically positioning her approach as superior, represented one of the subtle but significant shifts in our relationship. Where previously our interactions had been shaped by implicit competition and hierarchical positioning, we had gradually developed capacity for mutual recognition of complementary insights. "She would have enjoyed seeing how it all played out," I said, glancing toward the memorial bench with its simple engraving. "Catherine Elizabeth Bennett, designer of spaces and possibilities, especially our collaboration on the studio's expansion. A plot twist she may have hoped for but couldn't guarantee." Rebecca agreed with unexpected insight. "The best strategic planning creates potential for positive outcomes without requiring them to unfold exactly as envisioned." As we sat together in the garden our grandmother had originally designed and we had collaboratively enhanced, I reflected on the complex inheritance she had left us. Not just material assets, but invitation to evolution. Opportunity to recognize patterns while choosing whether to maintain or transform them. The lawyer revealing the truth about the necklace had initiated a cascade of recalibrations within our family system, creating space for more authentic engagement with both historical dynamics and future possibilities. The blue topaz at my throat caught morning sunlight as I turned toward Rebecca, its distinctive quality of illumination, simultaneously reflecting and containing light, seemingly embodying the legacy our grandmother had most hoped to transfer. Clarity of perception balanced with depth of understanding, the capacity to see both surface appearances and underlying realities with equal appreciation for their distinctive contributions to the complete picture.